Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. The most critical variable in the economic recovery is the labour market. It will determine whether the economic recovery continues and when interest rates will rise. The Reserve Bank has made it clear that it wants to see wages growth at sustainably 3% plus levels before it moves on the official cash rate. So I thought it'd be a good time to work through the detail of the labour market and just have a look at where it's up to. To help me out, I welcome back Carlos Cacho, Chief Economist at Jarden Group. Carlos, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Good to be here.
So up front, why is the labour market so important?
Well, as you hit on in the intro, it's really the key variable the RBA is watching. The RBA wants to achieve inflation between 2 to 3%, and to achieve that, in its view and generally through history, you've required to see wages growth of around 3 to 3.5%. And obviously, to hit that wages growth target, we need a relatively tight labour market, such that businesses are increasing wages to attract workers. And so we basically just need to generate that jobs growth to get to that tight labour market and eventually achieve that inflation.
So there's been so much good news about the labour market, and maybe that's because where it's come from. Where is the labour market up to now in historical terms?
Look, it depends how you look at it. If you look at it from the unemployment rate, we're still higher than the RBA would like to be. The unemployment rate's about 5.5% at the moment. We were around about 5% pre-COVID. Realistically, the RBA probably wants to see that in the low fours. They want to achieve what's known as the NAIRU, or the natural rate of unemployment. And that's believed to be somewhere between 4.5% and maybe high 3%. So we don't really know where it is. And that's the level at which you think you start getting wages growth because effectively the labour force is fully employed. So we've got a while to get there. If you look at other indicators like jobs growth, we've seen the strongest jobs growth on record. Obviously, that's driven by the fact that we lost a lot of jobs at the start of COVID. And then if you take a look towards the future and you look at things that are a leading indicator for employment, things like hiring intentions for businesses from the NAB survey or job advertisements from a range of indicators, we're actually seeing the best strength in those indicators on record. So we're seeing more job vacancies now than we've pretty much ever seen in series like the ABS vacancies data. And we're seeing businesses really telling us that they want to hire a lot more workers over the next 3 to 12 months. So that's a really positive backdrop for the labour market recovery to continue.
Okay, one of the areas that you've looked at particularly is migration and skilled and unskilled workers coming into Australia. What's the story there? Because obviously our borders are closed. We don't have migration at the moment.
Yeah, so migration plays a really important role in the Australian labour market. Historically, we've had population growth of around 1.5%, and that's led to labour force growth a bit higher than that. So even though we've had quite strong jobs growth compared to global peers for the last couple of years, we've also had very strong labour force growth, and that's meant it's been harder to get the unemployment rate down than it would be otherwise. At the moment, obviously, the borders are closed, and so that labour force growth is going to be a lot weaker. You've got a lot less new people coming into the country looking for work, and so that's going to mean that even a lower level of employment growth than we've historically seen can get you a much faster fall in the unemployment rate. So that's really important for the RBA outlook, and that means, in our view, we're going to see the unemployment rate fall faster than expected. But it also brings in a risk because if you don't have those new people coming into the country, you don't have an increase in skilled labour in some sectors. And that's going to mean that even though businesses want to employ people, there may simply not be the skills out there in the market to be employed and hired. And the way we've looked at this is kind of trying to focus on migration in two ways. There's two major forms of migration in Australia. We've got permanent migrants, so that's people who arrive in Australia either with permanent residency or citizenship. They're usually arriving here most likely to be working in highly skilled, highly paid professions. So that's the biggest occupation group that they work in is what's called professionals and managers. That can include everything from lawyers, accountants, managers within firms. So they're usually going to be coming over to Australia, probably already with a job and already with permanent residency. The other big group of migrants we have are temporary residents. So these are people who are coming to Australia and originally intending to stay here only on a temporary basis. The largest drivers of this are international students and temporary workers. And while you do still see quite a few of them working in those higher skilled areas, they're on the whole more likely to be in lower skilled employment. So an occupation that the ABS calls labourers. Now this includes things like building labourers, but it also includes a lot of areas like workers in hospitality.
Yep.
And so that's particularly prevalent among international students where they might be studying and work a few hours a week at a cafe on their weekends or on their days off. And so what we've seen with COVID is obviously with the closed borders, we've seen both of those forms of migration cut back. So we've had less supply of the highly skilled employees coming here on a permanent basis. And we've also seen international students and temporary workers not only stop arriving, but actually leave. If we look at the visa data, the number of temporary visas in Australia for students and temporary workers has gone down by about 250,000 since the start of COVID. So that's actually less people in Australia on those visas now than this time last year.
Okay, now you've done some work in terms of how it's affected specific sectors. We might just run through those, and we'll start with mining because BHP a couple of weeks ago, for example, said they couldn't find enough truck drivers in the Pilbara. What's happening with the lack of migration and mining?
Well, traditionally, mining's obviously quite a boom and bust sector. And so what you've often seen is in the good times, mining will pull people in from other sectors. So everyone probably remembers the stories from the last mining boom when truck drivers in Sydney and Melbourne were going up to WA and North Queensland, getting paid 100 grand plus a year to drive trucks around there. And so, when things are good, when times are good, they pull people in. That's not just from around Australia, but that's also internationally. There is a bit of a flexibility in the mining workforce where there's people who will travel around the world to where the work is. And that's especially true in the highly skilled employment in that area. So you're kind of mining engineers and stuff. So at the moment, there's not enough labour for the mining sector there. The vacancies there are, while they're not as high as they were during the last mining boom, they're at the highest they've been since then. You've got over about 3% of positions vacant in mining.
Wow.
The other challenge for mining at the moment is that some of the traditional sectors that they've taken employees from, areas like construction, particularly in the investment phase of mining, you were employing a lot of electricians, plumbers, metal workers. So you're employing a lot of people who might otherwise be working on construction sites. And you're also employing a lot of people who might work in logistics, truck drivers, etc. Now, the problem is at the moment, those two sectors are also booming. The construction sector is having the most amount of activity for freestanding houses on record, and logistics is going through a massive boom because of the growth in online sales due to COVID. So not only is mining doing really well, but the other sectors that they might normally take employees out of are also really strong. And that's forcing companies to either have to cut back on production or slow their investment because they can't get the workers, or they're having to pay more. And we're starting to see more companies start reporting that through their earnings.
Stay with me, Carlos. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Jarden Chief Economist, Carlos Cacho. What about agriculture? Because we're having such a good year in terms of rains, particularly along the east coast, and prices are really high for beef and some of the grains. Are there enough workers in that area?
That's another area where there's a lot of trouble at the moment. So agriculture has traditionally been reliant, particularly within horticulture, so particularly fruit, so things like oranges, avocados, bananas. That's been very reliant on migrant labour, essentially. So that can either be working holiday makers who might come to Australia and backpackers who might come here and they might work a few weeks during harvest and then travel on to somewhere else. Or it's also quite a lot of migrant labour where you have workers from, in particular, the Pacific Islands who might go to far north Queensland and work there during the harvest. Due to COVID, those groups aren't coming in at the moment. There are some state government initiatives that are trying to bring in groups to fill that void, but agriculture has been one of the areas where we've seen the biggest squeeze. So since the start of COVID, vacancies in agriculture are up by about 250%.
Wow.
Now, it's still not that many jobs in absolute terms because it's a fairly small sector, but there's been a huge increase. And we're seeing more and more producers reporting labour shortages to the extent that in some cases, fruit is having to be left to rot on the tree because there's just not enough workers to bring it to market, which is a real shame because obviously a lot of these farmers have had quite a tough couple of years between the drought and then the bushfires.
Yeah. And the other sector that we all talk about all the time is hospitality. Where's that up to in terms of the migration issue?
Very similar story to agriculture there. Hospitality has had a 250% increase as well in vacancies since the start of COVID. And that's an area where it's more those lower skilled migrants I was speaking about before. Obviously, there's a lot of international students and temporary workers who might work in hospitality. So you've lost some of them and you don't have them coming into the country anymore. So the sector's lost people. On top of that, during the lockdowns, particularly the extended lockdown in Melbourne, you had a lot of people who left the hospitality industry. They lost their jobs because their employers had to shut down. If you're a permanent resident or a citizen, you were eligible for JobKeeper, so you might have stayed connected to your employer. But if you weren't, you're not eligible. So your employer, unfortunately, would have had to let you go. And in most cases, those people have gone out and they've found work in other sectors. We heard recently from Wesfarmers that Bunnings actually has quite a few employees who, over the COVID period, came from hospitality and are actually now preferring their work-life balance, the permanence of the shifts, more kind of reliable work that they're getting there working in retail, and so they don't actually plan to go back to hospitality. And so I think the sector's been hit by these two factors where you've got less supply from migration, but you've also got people who've left the industry due to COVID.
I realise how tough it is. Yeah.
And so that's really hard, obviously, for the employees in hospitality. Some of them in areas like accommodation, where demand is really strong with domestic tourism booming, I think you will see wage rises to try and bring the right people into the sector. But other areas like the neighbourhood cafe, it's probably a bit more challenging because it's much harder for them to put up prices to cover those wages. And the margins in the sector in general are quite narrow. So it is a challenge for them to cover the cost of having to pay an extra, $2, $3, $4, $5 an hour to get the workers in, especially if in some cases they may have been paying international students maybe less than award wages, which, as we know from the media, not everyone's doing that. There's certainly quite a few cases of international students being underpaid in hospitality.
Okay, so if you bring all this together, there's got to be pressure on wages. What's that mean in terms of what the Reserve Bank's thinking about?
Well, I think the Reserve Bank's really going to wait until they see the whites of the eyes of inflation and wages. But we think that's going to come around a bit sooner than they do. So the leading indicators we look at for wage growth, things like the underutilization rate, which is unemployment and people who are underemployed or wanting to work more hours, that's back around where it was pre-COVID, and that's suggesting wages growth should pick up. You've also got the share of firms that are saying labour's a constraint on their production, which is now the highest level since the GFC. So we're definitely seeing signs that wages should start picking up, and we're hearing about it in some of these sectors. So areas like mining services, construction, and professional services. When we talk to people in the industry, we're hearing about 5 to 10% wage rises in some cases. Now, that's not across the board, that's more for new employees, but we believe that those should start filtering through as people realise that there's such strong demand for those skills. We'll see higher wages come through those sectors. Similarly, we think that is also going to happen at the lower end. While not everyone in hospitality is going to be able to pay higher wages, but you are going to see some wage growth there, given the strong demand and limited supply. Wages are the biggest needle, kind of the biggest mover for inflation for the RBA. Wage growth drives, we think, in our view, about a third of the total CPI basket. So once you do start to see those wages pick up, that's going to lead to a broader pickup in prices across the economy, particularly in services. And that should hopefully lead to a pickup in headline and underlying inflation over, back towards getting to the RBA's target by 2023. And we think that should mean the RBA is hiking ahead of their 2024 guidance, probably sometime in late 2023.
Well, okay. Carlos, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
That was Carlos Cacho, Chief Economist at Jarden Group. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.